Chapter 76. Just now, you guys learned about my background. My family is very wealthy. From the Civil War until now, many generations have passed and still hold a huge fortune. For this reason, they look down on common people, and my wife Penelope. She is not only of commoner origin, but also an orphan who grew up in an orphanage. Penelope and I love each other, but the members of my family, they cannot accept me being with her. Today is our wedding day. I brought Penelope back to the family's old home, but I did not receive their blessing. There was no other choice, we could only leave. Her wedding dress was torn because when she left my family's old house, the long wedding dress got caught on the hook on the iron door, so we could only tear off the caught part. We have no secrets, we are just an unlucky couple. After Charlie finished speaking, the arrogance on his face was gone. He smiled bitterly and shrugged. I've told my story, now do you believe we are innocent? The hotel became quiet again. No one knew whether the couple's story was true or not, but it seemed that they didn't need to lie. John looked at the body of police officer Ed. He had been strangled with a wire-like weapon and suffocated. The murder weapon was not at the scene. But in a hotel filled with such miscellaneous items, even if the person deliberately hid such a thing, it would be impossible to find it. But there was something very strange. If the death was due to suffocation, and Ed was a professionally trained adult man, he could not have been strangled quietly and without making any sound. But judging from the condition of the body at the scene, it was clear that the murderer did not encounter much resistance. Ed's face was bruised, his expression was distorted and painful, but there were no signs of struggle on his body. This could only mean that Ed had lost the ability to resist when attacked by the murderer. Obviously, it was not only the police who noticed this. The bride Penelope suddenly said, "Could it be that an acquaintance committed the crime?" Officer Ed was not on guard, so he was easily strangled by the murderer. Her eyes glanced at the two policemen. Duke, who had been by Ed's side the entire time, sneered, "What do you mean? If you have something to say, just say it. There's no need to hide it like that." Penelope said, "I don't mean anything else, but doesn't everyone want to find the culprit right now?" Her beautiful blue eyes swept over the crowd, and she slowly said, "I'm just gathering public opinion. After all, if we catch the culprit 1 minute late, our lives will lose 1 minute of safety." The room was extremely quiet. It seemed like everyone agreed with Penelope's assessment. John's anger that had just risen was like being doused with a basin of cold water. He glanced around at the people with different expressions but all unanimously silent, and suddenly understood something. In this small-town hotel that had lost contact with the outside world, the one in charge was no longer the police representing the social order. The most worrying thing had happened. These guests all had their own thoughts, they did not trust the police. Although until now, they had behaved very obediently. Their suspicious gazes glanced back and forth. John took a deep breath. "If everyone has their own guesses, you can say them now, let's discuss them together." After all, he could no longer control them. At this time it was truly time to gather public opinion. It was better to just listen to everyone's guesses, maybe we could even find the culprit's loopholes. Charlie's pupils dilated, and after listening, he said, "Have you ever thought about why Officer Ed didn't resist? If it wasn't an acquaintance who committed the crime like my wife said, then it can only be proven. Perhaps, it's not that he didn't want to resist, but that he didn't have the strength to resist." "That's right," Malcolm nodded in agreement. "Compared to the theory that an acquaintance committed the crime, I also agree that someone made Officer Ed lose the strength to resist first." John and Duke looked at each other, and without prior agreement, they thought of a possibility. "Could it be?" "Think about it," Charlie said loudly. "Do you remember? After entering the hotel, none of us drank that cup of tea. Only Officer Ed drank it. Perhaps the hotel owner was the culprit. They put sleeping pills in the tea, made people unconscious, then killed them and then robbed the victims." The man finished his guess, his handsome face filled with certainty and confidence. At this moment, the figure of the hotel owner Eva quietly appeared on the first floor. As soon as she stepped out of the room, she heard Charlie specifically name her as the culprit. Eva's facial muscles twitched, and she looked at Charlie with a cold smile. What are you talking about? Am I the culprit? This is so funny. If I wanted to hurt you, then you would have eaten the meat pie too. Why aren't you unconscious? Eva's rebuttal had no loopholes, and Charlie was a little worried, but since no one had drunk it, the cups of tea that Eva had poured for them earlier had all been spilled. He couldn't find any evidence to refute. Because of his anxiety, he attracted a few suspicious gazes. Eva sneered, turned her face away, and seemed angry. She turned back to her room. From the outside, the room was pitch black and nothing could be seen inside. Malcolm sighed. The strong man turned his attention to Colm, looking at him with some confusion. Dude, why are you covered in water? Also, it seems like you didn't rent a room, right? You were still on the first floor and didn't see anyone come down. Belch trembled as he listened, pretending to be calm on the surface. Hearing this, he couldn't help but glance at the ugly man, remembering that this man had tried to help him and Siddle before. The ugly man, Colm, I don't know, I didn't see anything. He explained a few more sentences. I went out to use the restroom for a while, right next to the hotel. When I came back, Officer Ed was already lying on the floor. But before I went out, Officer Ed was already lying on the table. Maybe the killer took advantage of my absence to do it. I didn't know that Officer Ed was dead until the other police officer came down and found out, then I found out. Charlie sneered. Then the time you spent in the toilet was also too long. Colm glanced at Charlie. You want to say that I am the culprit? Otherwise, what? Charlie did not want to be outdone and replied, you are the biggest suspect here now. Whether what you say is true or not depends on your mouth. The murderer killed someone right when you were in the toilet. What a coincidence. Who else could it be? That's right, not to mention you were also responsible for transporting the corpses. Who knows if your mentality is distorted while doing that kind of work? Colm's eyes were fierce, his ugly face revealed a cold smile, his lips trembled, wanting to refute, but at this moment everyone else looked at him with suspicious eyes. Indeed, he was the most suspicious person. Except for one person. The culprit is not him. The blonde girl who had been standing quietly to the side suddenly spoke up. After everyone looked over, she calmly continued, there's more than one culprit. What do you mean? Charlie frowned. Belch also looked at his sister in confusion. What do you mean? Siddle turned her gaze to Officer Ed, the person who knocked Officer Ed unconscious, stabbed Officer Ed, and wrote provocative words on the table, most likely. Not the same person. That means, there are at least 3 culprits. Someone exclaimed in horror. John also frowned at the handwriting on the table. The handwriting was crooked. At first glance it seemed like someone had intentionally written with their left hand, but from the handwriting, it was impossible to tell who it was. The blonde girl stood aside with her arms crossed, slowly saying, I'm just guessing. She curled her lips, tilting her head slightly, but the culprit who killed Officer Ed couldn't be the same person. It wasn't even human. Charlie said angrily, if the killer and the writer are not the same person, then what is the writer's intention? He or she intends to make us. He suddenly shuddered, he or she wants us to kill each other. Malcolm muttered, then it seems that our previous line of reasoning was completely wrong. Maybe the murderer only has a grudge against Officer Ed, and is taking the opportunity to take revenge. But who would write this line, intending to take advantage of the situation? Colm seemed relieved after being relieved. He slowly glanced at Siddle. But, Penelope frowned, if there are many murderers, then wouldn't. Are most of the people at the scene the murderers? She was right. There were currently 5 groups of people, the police, Malcolm, Colm, the newlyweds, and the sisters. If there were 3 groups of people involved in Ed's death, then only a few were truly innocent. The hotel suddenly fell silent again. They had been arguing for a long time about who the murderer was, but now they suddenly received news. The murderer turned out to be themselves. John was a little scared when he saw the atmosphere become clearly restless, knowing that the most important thing now was to suppress everyone's panic. He looked at Siddle seriously. Little girl, there are some things that can't be said nonsense. How did you come to the conclusion that there was more than one murderer? The others immediately looked over with suspicion. I told you, I'm just guessing. Siddle looked back at them coldly. The details of how I came to the conclusion are confidential, believe it or not, it's up to you. I can't guarantee the accuracy of this guess. After the blonde girl finished speaking, she looked down impatiently and started fiddling with her phone. Siddle was sending a message to Belch. She didn't want to cause panic, but the problem was that her guess might be a bit cruel to these people. But it was obvious that this room was not a good person, so it was better to let them fight each other first. It was best to fight so that both sides suffered losses. Belch looked down at his sister's text message on his phone. Don't go near Malcolm, he might be crazy.